Chapter 1. The question that isn't a question. Brian Michaels was chopping an onion when Maggie told him about the trip. Not aggressively. Not with tears or dramatic pauses. Just conversationally, the way people mention a new coffee shop or a change in traffic patterns. So, she said, leaning against the counter and watching him work. The girls want to do a weekend away next month. Brian nodded, eyes on the cutting board. His knife moved steadily, precise without being careful. He had learned long ago that onions punished hesitation. Where to? He asked. Miami. He nodded again. Okay. Maggie waited. Brian finished the onion, slid it into a bowl, and wiped his hands on a towel. He turned to face her fully, giving her his attention the way he always did, unhurried, complete. When? He asked. She told him. A long weekend. Flights were cheap. Everyone was excited. Brian listened. Really listened. Maggie could tell because he didn't interrupt, didn't preemptively reassure her, didn't fill the space with noise. When she finished, he rested his hip against the counter and crossed his arms loosely. What are you planning to do? He asked. That was it. No warning tone. No raised eyebrow. No lecture disguised as concern. Just a question. Maggie felt something shift in her chest, subtle but undeniable. I mean, you know, she said. Hang out. Beach. Dinner. Stuff. Brian nodded once more. Clubs? She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. But he noticed. Probably, she said. They like to go out. He studied her face, not searching for wrongdoing but for alignment. Brian had never been interested in catching people in lies. He believed most people told the truth. The problem was that they often didn't like what the truth revealed once it was spoken aloud. Okay, he said. That was all. No argument. No warning shot. No rules. He turned back to the stove and resumed cooking as if nothing significant had happened, which somehow made everything feel significant. Maggie stood there, suddenly unsure what she was supposed to do next. She had prepared herself for resistance, maybe disappointment. Even irritation would have been easier, something she could react to. But Brian had given her none of that. Instead, he'd handed her the full weight of her own choice. They ate dinner as usual, talked about work, laughed about a ridiculous email Brian had received from a client who clearly thought per my last message was a threat instead of a phrase. Brian washed the dishes. Maggie dried. Everything was normal. Too normal. Later, curled together on the couch, Maggie found herself watching him instead of the movie. Brian was relaxed, one arm draped behind her, eyes on the screen. The same man who had been with her for 5 years. The same man who had never once raised his voice at her, never checked her phone, never demanded reassurance. A man who had also never pretended not to know who he was. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. She swallowed. Are you upset? Brian glanced down at her, thoughtful. Not exactly. That word landed with care. Not exactly. What does that mean? She asked. It means I'm not angry, he said. And I'm not trying to control what you do. I just pay attention. To what? To whether I still fit in your life, he said simply. Her throat tightened. I love you, she said quickly. I know, Brian replied. And he did. He had never doubted that. But love, to Brian, was not a floating concept. It was directional. It moved toward something or away from it. It made choices. I'm not telling you not to go, he continued. I wouldn't. You're an adult. I trust you to make decisions. I just notice what those decisions say. About me? She asked. About us, he corrected gently. Maggie nodded, staring at the muted television. I need to think about it, she said. That's fine, Brian said, and meant it. They went to bed at their usual time. Brian fell asleep quickly. Maggie did not. She lay awake, replaying the conversation. The calm in his voice, the absence of accusation, the way he had treated her like someone capable of choosing well or poorly. It dawned on her, slowly and uncomfortably, that this wasn't a fight she could win by being right. This was a crossroads. Her friends had already started texting. Group chat exploding with excitement. Outfit planning. Inside jokes. One last wild weekend before we're all old, someone had written. Maggie stared at the message. One last. She thought of Brian in the kitchen. Steady hands, quiet certainty. A man who didn't beg to be chosen, who didn't compete with noise, who simply lived his life with intention and invited her to walk alongside him. She loved him. She wanted a future with him. And suddenly she understood that wanting something wasn't the same as choosing it. The realization sat heavy in her chest. Tomorrow she decided she would talk to her mother, because something was changing, and she wasn't sure yet who she was going to be when it did. Chapter 2. The weight of quiet. Morning arrived without ceremony. Brian woke before his alarm, as he usually did, and lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the apartment settling around him. Maggie slept on her side, facing away, one arm tucked beneath her pillow. Her breathing was slow, even, peaceful. He studied the ceiling and let his thoughts arrange themselves. Brian had never believed in catastrophizing. If something mattered, he addressed it. If it didn't, he let it go. What unsettled him now wasn't fear of what Maggie might do. It was the clarity that had settled in his chest the night before. A quiet understanding that something fundamental was being measured. He wasn't angry. He didn't feel betrayed. He felt alert. Brian rose carefully, showered, dressed, and brewed coffee. When Maggie emerged, hair pulled into a loose knot, she looked at him with a searching expression she didn't seem fully aware of wearing. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied, sliding a mug across the counter. They moved around each other easily, the choreography of 5 years. Yet Maggie noticed every small thing now. The way he didn't rush, didn't hover, didn't ask follow-up questions about the trip. It was as if he had placed the matter on a shelf between them, neither hidden nor pressed. She left for work feeling heavier than when she'd woken. Maggie's phone buzzed before she even reached her desk. "Tara, flights are booked," smiling face with horns. "Lena, this is going to be legendary. Jess. No boyfriends, no responsibilities, just vibes." Maggie stared at the last message longer than the others. "No boyfriends." She typed, erased, retyped. "Maggie, sounds fun. I'm still figuring things out." Pause. Then, "Tara, figuring what out?" "Lena. Girl, don't be boring, Jess. Brian will survive one weekend." Face with rolling eyes. Maggie set the phone face down. She tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting. Not to the clubs or the beach, but to Brian's voice. "I just pay attention." It bothered her how reasonable he'd been. How he hadn't framed the trip as a test, yet somehow it felt like one anyway. Or maybe not a test of loyalty but of direction. At lunch, she joined her coworkers in the break room. Conversation bounced from weekend plans to office gossip. Someone complained about dating apps. "I swear," a coworker said, "the moment a guy gets even slightly serious, I get bored." Maggie smiled weakly, stirring her soup. She wondered when serious had become synonymous with small. That evening, Brian met his friend Marcus for a run along the river. Marcus had known Brian since college and had long ago accepted that Brian processed things best while moving. "You're quiet," Marcus said after a mile. Brian shrugged. "Just thinking. About Maggie." It wasn't a question. Brian exhaled, breath steady. "She told me about a trip. Girls' weekend. Party destination. And nothing yet." Marcus glanced at him. "You okay with it?" Brian considered the question carefully. "I'm okay with her choosing what she wants." That sounds like a politician's answer. It's an accurate one. They ran in silence for a bit. "You worried she'll cheat?" Marcus asked finally. "No," Brian said without hesitation. "Then what's the issue?" Brian slowed to a walk, hands on hips. "I don't build my life assuming I'm temporary. I don't want to be with someone who needs to step out of our relationship to feel alive." Marcus nodded slowly. "Fair. I'm not here to supervise her," Brian continued. "I'm here to see if we're moving the same way. And if you're not?" Brian met his friend's gaze. "Then we're not." Marcus studied him. "You know most people would have made it a whole thing." "I know. And you didn't because?" "Because if I have to convince someone to prioritize me, I already have my answer." They resumed running. That night, Maggie joined her friends for drinks, something she'd done countless times before. The bar was loud, neon lit, packed with bodies pressed too close. Her friends were animated, already talking outfits and flirting with strangers. A man leaned over, shouting something she couldn't hear. Tara laughed, touching his arm. Maggie smiled politely, sipping her drink. "This is why we're going," Jess said, grinning. "No expectations. No limits." Maggie nodded, but the words landed wrong. No limits. She thought of Brian folding laundry with methodical care. Of him remembering her coffee order without fail. Of the way he never asked for reassurance but showed up consistently. She checked her phone. A message from Brian sat unread. Not because he just sent it, but because she'd been afraid to open it. When she did, it was simple. "Brian, hope you're having a good night." That was it. No subtext. No surveillance. She felt a lump rise in her throat. Tara nudged her. "You okay?" "Yeah," Maggie said. "Just tired." They stayed another hour. Maggie laughed when appropriate, but the laughter felt borrowed. On the ride home, she stared out the window, city lights blurring together. When she got back to the apartment, Brian was on the couch reading. He looked up, smiled. Hey, she replied, hanging her jacket. "How was it?" "Fine," she said, then paused. "Fun." He nodded. "Good." She waited for more. It didn't come. Later, lying awake beside him again, Maggie understood something she hadn't before. Brian wasn't pulling away. He was standing exactly where he always had. And if she moved in a different direction, it wouldn't be because he failed to hold on. It would be because she let go. The realization pressed down on her chest, heavy and clarifying. Tomorrow she would go see her mother, because the quiet was getting louder. Chapter 3. Mothers see the whole board. Maggie's mother lived in the same house Maggie had grown up in. A modest place with creaky steps and a front porch that always smelled faintly of lavender. When Maggie pulled into the driveway, she sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel. She felt ridiculous for being nervous. She was 28 years old, financially independent, in a long-term relationship. And yet, she had the distinct sensation that she was about to be told something she already knew but hadn't yet accepted. Her mother opened the door before Maggie could knock. "You look like someone who needs tea," her mother said, stepping aside. Maggie smiled weakly. "Am I that obvious?" "You're my daughter," her mother replied. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Maggie had once done homework and complained about curfews. Her mother poured tea and waited, not with impatience, but with the calm assurance of someone who knew silence would eventually do the work for her. Maggie wrapped her hands around the mug. "Brian and I didn't fight," she said finally. Her mother raised an eyebrow. "That's usually how these things start." Maggie laughed despite herself. "My friends want me to go on a girls' trip, party weekend, the kind of place that doesn't exactly have a reputation for strengthening relationships." "And Brian?" her mother asked. "He didn't tell me not to go." Her mother nodded slowly. "Of course he didn't. That's the problem," Maggie said, exhaling. "He just asked what I planned to do. And then he went about his night like everything was normal." Her mother smiled into her tea. "Ah, that feels loaded," Maggie said. "It is," her mother agreed. She set the mug down. "Let me ask you something. In the 5 years you've been with Brian, what's the longest relationship any of your friends has had?" Maggie frowned. "I mean, I don't know. A few months." "Think," her mother said gently. Maggie did. Faces and names passed through her mind. Excitement, heartbreak, reinvention, rinse and repeat. 3 months, Maggie said quietly. "Just over that." Her mother nodded. "And how many times have they told you they want what you have?" Maggie swallowed. "A lot. And how often do they make choices that lead toward it?" Maggie didn't answer. Her mother leaned back in her chair. "Friends are important, but friendships, like anything else, need alignment. When your life goals diverge completely, what's left?" "Memories," Maggie said. "Yes," her mother replied. "And memories are lovely, but they are not the same thing as a shared direction." Maggie stared into her tea. "Your friends are all single," her mother continued. "They see you in a stable, healthy relationship, and they're jealous." "That feels harsh," Maggie said, reflexively. "It's not a judgment," her mother said. "It's an observation. They'd rather see your relationship fail than admit they might be the common denominator in their own stories." Maggie's chest tightened. Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You found a good man. He stayed loyal to you for 5 years. He hasn't made you question where you stand. And now you're letting your friends play whack-a-mole with your relationship." Maggie's eyes burned. "I don't want to lose them." "You won't lose them all," her mother said. "But some friendships end when they stop making sense. That doesn't make anyone a villain." They sat quietly for a moment. "You have a choice," her mother said finally. "You can build a life with Brian. Predictable, intentional, meaningful. Or you can keep chasing your friends' approval and join them in their never-ending search for something they keep running past." Maggie blinked back tears. "I love him. I know," her mother said. "But loving someone doesn't exempt you from fighting for what you want." She stood and wrapped Maggie in a hug, firm and grounding. "You're a good person. But sometimes good people need to stop living in the past. Stop preserving dynamics that no longer serve them. The future doesn't arrive on its own." When Maggie left, the afternoon light felt sharper somehow, as if everything were newly outlined. On the drive home, her phone buzzed again. "Tara, can you send outfit ideas?" "Jess, we're doing matching looks." One night, smiling face with hard eyes. Maggie didn't respond. She pulled into her apartment complex and sat in the car, engine off, heart steady. Brian wasn't asking her to choose him over her friends. He was asking whether she was choosing a future or just killing time. And for the first time, Maggie knew her answer. She just hadn't said it yet. Chapter 4. Parallel nights. Friday arrived the way it always did, quietly, without announcing whether it would be ordinary or consequential. Brian left work on time, stopped by the grocery store, and picked up the things he always did when he planned to cook. Fresh vegetables, chicken thighs, a loaf of bread that cost more than it needed to because he liked it. He moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, earbuds in, music low. Nothing about his evening routine had changed. That was intentional. At home, he prepped dinner, cleaned as he went, and opened a window to let the early spring air in. He set the table for 2 without thinking about it. The habit was ingrained, not symbolic. Maggie texted around 6. "Maggie, going out with the girls tonight. I'll be late." Brian read the message, nodded once to himself, and replied, "Brian, have fun. Be safe." That was all. He didn't add a question mark. He didn't add a reminder. He didn't add a second message 10 minutes later to clarify tone. He meant it. He ate dinner alone, scrolling through a documentary he'd been meaning to watch. Halfway through, he paused it and smiled faintly at himself. 5 years ago, this might have bothered him more. Or rather, 5 years ago, he might have believed it should bother him. But Brian had learned the difference between discomfort and misalignment. Discomfort passed. Misalignment grew. He cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, and read until his eyes grew heavy. At 11, he turned off the lights and went to bed. Maggie's night moved at a different tempo. She met her friends at a rooftop bar downtown. All neon signs and bass-heavy music. The air buzzed with anticipation. Drinks arrived quickly. Laughter spilled easily. "This is what I'm talking about," Tara said, raising her glass. "Freedom." Maggie smiled and clinked glasses. A group of men hovered nearby, offering smiles that were practiced and confident. One leaned over to Maggie. "You celebrating something?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just catching up." He grinned. "Best reason there is." Her friends laughed. Tara introduced herself. Jess asked where he was from. The man glanced back at Maggie, clearly interested. She felt nothing. Not discomfort. Not temptation. Just distance. The music grew louder as the night wore on. Her friends danced, arms raised, bodies loose. Maggie joined in for a while, moving with them, letting the rhythm carry her. But each song seemed to stretch too long. At one point, Tara leaned close and shouted, "This is gonna be Miami energy. Babe, you ready?" Maggie laughed reflexively. "Sure." But her body didn't believe it. She checked her phone. No new messages. She imagined Brian asleep already, lights off, alarm set. The thought should have felt boring. Instead, it felt grounding. Around midnight, Maggie slipped away to the bathroom, locking herself into a stall and leaning her forehead against the cool metal wall. She breathed in slowly. She wasn't missing out. She was outgrowing something. When she returned, her friends were debating outfits again, talking about single-girl chaos, like it was a personality trait. Maggie smiled, nodded, and felt herself drift further to the edge of the circle. She left shortly after 1, citing an early morning. No one protested much. "Text when you're home," Jess said distractedly. Maggie nodded and walked out into the night air. When Maggie entered the apartment, the lights were off. She moved quietly, slipping off her shoes, setting her purse down. The place felt calm, undisturbed. Brian's book lay open on the nightstand. His glasses rested beside it. She changed and slid into bed, careful not to wake him. He stirred anyway. "Hey," he murmured, voice thick with sleep. "Hey," she whispered. "How was it?" She hesitated. "Just a moment." "Loud," she said softly. "Fun, I guess." He smiled faintly, eyes still closed. "Glad you got home safe." She lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing even out again. This was the second parallel night they'd lived in a row, same roof, different worlds. And Maggie knew something had shifted permanently. Not because Brian had demanded anything, but because he hadn't. Chapter 5. Choosing is an action. Maggie didn't announce her decision. That surprised even her. She woke Saturday morning with the kind of clarity that didn't buzz or sparkle. It simply sat there, solid and unmoving, like furniture you'd finally placed correctly after years of shifting it around. There was no dramatic resolve, no rehearsed speech forming in her mind. Just alignment. Brian was already up, moving quietly through the apartment. The smell of coffee drifted down the hall. Maggie lay still for a moment, listening. The ordinary sounds, cabinet doors, the low hum of the kettle, felt suddenly precious. When she joined him in the kitchen, he smiled the same way he always did. No searching, no guardedness. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter. For a moment, she simply watched him butter toast, sleeves rolled up, posture relaxed. There was a steadiness to him that she had always appreciated but never fully understood. Until now. "Do you have plans today?" she asked. "Gym later. Errands," he said. "You?" She shook her head. "Not really." He nodded. "We could grab lunch if you want." "I'd like that," she said, and meant more than the words suggested. They ate breakfast together. Maggie noticed how Brian listened when she spoke, how he didn't rush to fill silences. She realized something then. He hadn't withdrawn emotionally at all. He'd simply stopped compensating for uncertainty that wasn't his to resolve. After breakfast, Maggie texted the group chat. "Maggie, hey, quick update. I'm not going to Miami." The responses came fast. "Tara, what? Jess, are you serious?" "Lena, is this because of Brian?" Maggie stared at the screen, fingers hovering. "Maggie, it's because of me." A pause. Then Tara, "Wow. Okay. Jess, you're really choosing boring, huh?" Maggie felt the sting, but it didn't derail her. "Maggie, I'm choosing what I want." She muted the chat. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was spacious. Brian noticed the changes immediately, though Maggie never pointed them out. She lingered longer in conversations instead of half-checking her phone. She planned dinners instead of defaulting to takeout. She initiated touch more often, not out of reassurance-seeking but comfort. She showed up. One afternoon, Brian returned from the gym to find Maggie sitting on the living room floor, sorting through old photos spread around her. "What's this?" he asked, amused. "Memories," she said, smiling up at him. "And clutter." He sat beside her. They flipped through pictures, college parties, vacations, birthdays. Maggie laughed at some, cringed at others. I used to think this was what fun looked like, she said, gesturing to a photo of her and her friends mid-chaos. Brian glanced at it, then back at her. Was it? She considered. At the time, yes. I think it served a purpose. And now, she shrugged. Now it feels like noise. He nodded, accepting the answer without commentary. That evening, Maggie cooked dinner while Brian chopped vegetables. Their movements synced easily, a rhythm built over years. She felt a strange urge to say something, to explain, to clarify. But she stopped herself. She didn't need to persuade him. She needed to keep choosing him. The real test came midweek. Maggie met Tara for coffee after work. It had been planned before everything shifted, and Maggie hadn't canceled. She wanted to see what remained when the context changed. Tara was already seated, scrolling through her phone. So, Tara said as Maggie sat down, you really bailed. I did, Maggie said calmly. Tara scoffed. I just don't get it. You're not married. You don't have kids. Why act like you're locked in already? Maggie met her gaze. Because I'm building something. With who? Tara asked, though they both knew the answer. With Brian. Tara leaned back. Doesn't it ever scare you? Being so settled. Maggie smiled faintly. It scares me more to keep starting over. Tara was quiet for a moment. Then softer. I just don't want to lose you. You won't, Maggie said. But I'm not going to lose myself either. They hugged when they parted. It was sincere, but Maggie knew the friendship would change. And she was okay with that. That night, Maggie came home with intention buzzing under her skin. Brian was reading on the couch, glasses on, one leg tucked beneath him. He looked up as she entered. Hey, he said. She set her bag down and walked straight to him, straddling his lap. He laughed in surprise, hands instinctively finding her waist. Hi, she said. Something happen? He asked, smiling. Yes, she said simply. She kissed him, slow, deliberate, not urgent, certain. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead against his. I'm not going on the trip. Brian didn't respond immediately. He searched her face, not for justification, but for truth. Okay, he said. I didn't decide because you asked me to, she continued. You didn't. I decided because I realized I don't want a life where you're optional. Something in Brian's expression softened. Not relief, recognition. I'm not interested in being a cameo, he said quietly. I know, Maggie replied. I want you in the main cast. He smiled then, real and unguarded. Come here, he said, pulling her close. They stayed like that for a long moment, neither rushing to say more. Because this time, the choice wasn't just spoken. It was being lived. Chapter 6. The conversation that counts, they didn't talk about it right away. That was the strange thing. Once Maggie said she wasn't going on the trip, the tension didn't evaporate, but it did settle. Like dust after a door closes. Present, but no longer swirling. For 2 days, life moved forward normally. Work, dinner, small jokes exchanged in the kitchen. Brian didn't probe, didn't circle back with follow-up questions. Maggie noticed that too. He was giving her the same thing he always had, room to stand on her own decisions. But both of them knew there was a conversation waiting. It arrived on Tuesday night, unannounced but inevitable. They were cleaning up after dinner, working side by side. Maggie rinsed plates while Brian dried them. The radio played softly in the background, something instrumental, unobtrusive. Can we talk for a minute? Maggie asked. Brian set the towel down. Yeah. They moved to the couch, sitting close but not touching. That felt important somehow, space chosen rather than imposed. Maggie exhaled slowly. I want to explain something, not to justify it, just to be clear. Brian nodded. Okay. She looked at her hands. When you asked me what I planned to do on the trip, it caught me off guard. I figured it might, he said calmly. I expected you to tell me you didn't like it, she continued. Or to tell me not to go. Something I could push against. And when I didn't, it made me realize you weren't fighting for control, she said. You were watching for commitment. Brian leaned back slightly, considering her words. That's fair. I didn't see it at first, Maggie admitted. I thought you were being detached. I wasn't, he said gently. I was being honest. She nodded. I know that now. There was a pause. Not awkward, just measured. I want you to understand something too, Brian said. I wasn't testing you. I know. I wasn't waiting for you to fail, he continued. I just don't chase people who are unsure they want to walk with me. Maggie looked up at him then. Does that mean you were prepared for me to go? Brian met her gaze, steady as ever. Yes, her breath caught. And if I had? Then I would have learned something important, he said. About where we were. You would have ended things, she said quietly. Brian didn't dodge it. Eventually, yes, she swallowed. You wouldn't have tried to fix it. I don't fix misalignment, he replied. I fix problems. Those aren't the same thing. Maggie let the words settle. They didn't feel harsh. They felt clear. I don't want to be with someone who's afraid to lose me. Brian added. I want to be with someone who chooses me. Her eyes burned, not with fear, but recognition. I do choose you, she said. I just didn't realize how much noise I was letting in. He smiled faintly. We all have blind spots. She shifted closer to him. You didn't make me feel small. You didn't shame me. You didn't issue ultimatums. That's not partnership, he said. That's leverage. She laughed softly. You really don't do drama? Do you? I do commitment, Brian said. Drama is optional. That earned a real laugh from her. Maggie reached for his hand this time, threading her fingers through his. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. He squeezed her hand. You saw it when it mattered. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I talked to my mom. Brian smiled knowingly. That explains a lot. She said friends are nice, but shared direction is nicer. Smart woman. She also said sometimes good people have to fight for what they want, Maggie said. Not loudly, just deliberately. Brian kissed the top of her head. That sounds like you. They sat like that for a while, quiet and settled. The conversation hadn't been dramatic or emotional in the way Maggie might have expected months ago, but it had been definitive. Later that night, as they got into bed, Maggie turned toward him. Hey, she said. Yeah. Thank you for not mistaking your calm for weakness. Brian smiled in the dark. I never do. She laughed, resting her hand on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm beneath it. This wasn't a grand turning point marked by fireworks or declarations shouted into the void. It was something better. It was two people choosing the same direction, and finally saying it out loud. Chapter 7. Fallout. The fallout wasn't loud. That surprised Maggie most of all. She'd braced herself for slammed doors, dramatic confrontations, and friendship-ending speeches delivered over half-finished drinks. Instead, the aftermath arrived in quieter forms, longer gaps between messages, replies that felt thinner, invitations that came with less enthusiasm. It was grief without spectacle. The group chat stayed muted. Maggie didn't reopen it for days. When she finally did, it was to a string of photos from a dress fitting she hadn't known about. The caption read, Miami Prep, followed by laughing emojis. She stared at the screen, felt the familiar ache rise, and then let it pass. Some things didn't require a response. Brian noticed, of course. He always did. He didn't comment when Maggie grew quieter in the evenings or when she lingered a little longer in his arms. He didn't try to fill the space her friends had occupied. He let it be what it was. One night, Maggie came home later than usual. She'd met Jess for dinner, just the two of them. It hadn't gone badly. It hadn't gone well either. Jess had poked at her food and said, I just don't get why you choose stability, like it's a personality. Maggie had smiled, tired but steady. It's not my personality. It's my priority. Jess hadn't argued after that. She just nodded, like someone accepting the terms of a deal they hadn't realized was final. When Maggie walked through the door that night, Brian was on the couch, laptop open, deep in work. He looked up when he heard her keys. Hey, he said. Hey. He closed the laptop without hesitation. You okay? She shrugged, setting her bag down. Yeah, just adjusting. He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Want tea? He asked. Yes, she said, grateful. They sat together, mugs warming their hands, the apartment wrapped in quiet. You don't seem surprised, Maggie said after a while. I'm not, Brian replied. Change has a cost. She leaned into him. I didn't realize how much of my life was built around keeping things the same. Brian smiled faintly. Most people don't, until they decide otherwise. Brian had his own reckoning to make. Came unexpectedly, during lunch with Marcus a few days later. So, Marcus said, biting into a sandwich, how'd it shake out? She didn't go, Brian replied. Marcus grinned. Good. Brian didn't return the smile right away. But, Marcus prompted. But I had to accept that I was ready either way, Brian said. That wasn't easy. Marcus studied him. You're not afraid of losing her? Brian considered the question. I am. I just don't let fear decide my boundaries. That's a thin line, Marcus said. It's a necessary one, Brian replied. If I abandon myself to keep someone, I lose them anyway. Marcus nodded slowly. You ever worry you're too resolute? Brian chuckled. Sometimes. Then I remember that being clear is kinder than being flexible about things that matter. That night, Brian found Maggie sitting cross-legged on the bed, sorting through a small pile of items. Bracelets, old concert tickets, a faded sash from a bachelorette party years ago. Memory box? He asked. Sort of, she said. Donation pile. He sat beside her, picking up a bracelet. This one's seen some things. She laughed softly. It has. But it doesn't belong to who I am now. He watched her for a moment. You okay letting go? She nodded. I think I've been holding on to versions of myself that already said goodbye. He kissed her temple. That takes courage. She met his eyes. So does not chasing someone when they walk away. Something shifted between them then, not tension but depth. A shared understanding that choosing each other hadn't eliminated risk. It had clarified it. Later, Maggie's phone buzzed. A message from Tara. Tara, I hope Miami is worth it. Maggie stared at the words, then typed back. Maggie, I hope you find what you're looking for. There was no reply. She set the phone down and felt the quiet settle. Not lonely, not empty. Honest. Brian wrapped an arm around her. You don't regret it, do you? She shook her head. No, I just didn't realize growth would feel this clean. He smiled. That's how you know it's real. They sat together, grounded in the aftermath, not rushing to rebuild what had fallen away, because what remained was solid and chosen. Chapter 8. Not a cameo. The weeks that followed felt quieter but not smaller. That distinction mattered to Brian. Quiet meant intention. Small meant shrinking. And neither of them was shrinking anymore. Saturday morning sunlight poured into the apartment as Maggie moved through the kitchen barefoot, music playing softly from her phone. Brian watched from the doorway, coffee mug in hand, taking in the unhurried way she worked. She hummed along to the song, off-key and unapologetic, pausing to scribble something on the notepad they kept on the counter. What's that? He asked. She glanced up, smiling. A list. That's ominous. She laughed. It's not. Just plans. He raised an eyebrow. Plans for what? For us, she said simply. Brian stepped closer, leaning against the counter. Should I be worried? Only if you don't like farmers markets, weekend trips that don't involve hangovers, or the idea of actually using the dining table we bought 3 years ago. He smiled, slow and warm. I like all of those things. She turned the notepad toward him. It wasn't dramatic. No 5-year timeline or bullet points labeled milestones. Just ideas. Shared projects. A future sketched lightly, but deliberately. This isn't a contract, she said quickly. Just a direction. Brian studied the list, then looked back at her. This is you choosing. She nodded. I don't want to drift anymore. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Neither do I. Later that day, they walked through the park, hands brushing, conversation meandering. Families picnicked nearby. A couple argued quietly on a bench, tension thick between them. Maggie watched the couple for a moment, then said, I used to think passion looked like that. Brian followed her gaze. Conflict. Intensity, she corrected. Now it just looks exhausting. He chuckled. That's because you grew up. She bumped his shoulder. So did you. They stopped near a food truck, debating lunch options. Brian ordered tacos. Maggie added churros without consulting him. You're reckless, he said dryly. I contain multitudes, she replied. They ate on a low stone wall, laughing when sugar dusted Brian's shirt. This, Maggie said suddenly, gesturing around them, used to scare me. Sugar, Brian asked. Stability, she said. Choosing one thing instead of everything. He nodded. People confuse options with freedom. She smiled at him. You never did. I like depth, Brian said. Breadth is overrated. She laughed, then grew thoughtful. Thank you for not trying to win me. He tilted his head. What do you mean? For letting me come to you, she said. For standing still instead of chasing. Brian considered that. I wasn't standing still. I was walking my path. I just wasn't willing to detour for someone who hadn't decided where they were going. She reached for his hand, squeezing it. I'm glad our paths line up. Me too. That evening, as they settled onto the couch, Maggie's phone buzzed. A message from Jess. Jess, Miami was wild. Missed you. Hope you're happy. Maggie typed back without hesitation. Maggie, I am. She set the phone aside and leaned into Brian. He glanced down at her. Everything okay? Yes, she said. Just closing a chapter. He nodded. Endings are part of writing a good story. She smiled. You and your metaphors. They're accurate. She shifted, facing him fully. You know what I realized? What? I don't want a life that needs an escape hatch. Brian's expression softened. Neither do I. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Steady, unremarkable in the best possible way. I don't need chaos to feel alive, she continued. I need purpose. He kissed the top of her head. Then you're exactly where you should be. They sat there as the light faded, the city humming beyond the windows. No grand declarations. No dramatic music swell. Just two people aligned. Brian thought, not for the first time, that this was what partnership looked like, not fireworks but foundation. He wasn't a cameo, and neither was she. They were writing the same story now. Together. Chapter 9. Epilogue. The Long View. 1 year later, Brian Michaels stood in the doorway of a small bookstore, watching Maggie argue with the owner about whether a crooked shelf gave the place character or liability issues. It's character, Maggie insisted, hands on her hips, smiling. It's gravity, the owner countered. Gravity always wins. Brian hid a smile behind his coffee cup. They had moved into a slightly bigger place 6 months earlier, not because they needed the space but because it made sense. The new apartment had a second bedroom they turned into an office instead of a shrine to hypothetical children or Pinterest dreams. Practical, flexible, intentional, predictable, some might have said. Brian preferred chosen. Maggie finally conceded the argument and walked back over, looping her arm through his. You enjoy watching me lose battles, she accused. I enjoy watching you pick the right ones, he said. She laughed, leaning into him. Fair. They wandered the aisles together, fingers brushing along book spines. Maggie paused occasionally, pulling a title, skimming the back, placing it back with care. Brian noticed how relaxed she was. No restless energy. No scanning the room for something better. At the register, Maggie added a small notebook to the stack. What's that for? Brian asked as they stepped outside. She shrugged. Planning. Thoughts. Lists. He raised an eyebrow. I should be concerned? She smiled, slow and familiar. Only if you plan on disappearing. They walked a few blocks to a cafe they'd made a habit of visiting on Sundays. Same table. Same order. The barista knew them well enough to ask, usual? Yes, Brian and Maggie said in unison, then laughed. As they sat down, Maggie pulled the notebook from her bag and slid it across the table toward him. What's this? He asked. Open it. Inside were a few pages already filled, not dense or rigid. Notes about trips they wanted to take. Projects they wanted to tackle. Questions instead of ultimatums. Brian flipped through it slowly. This looks familiar, he said. It should, Maggie replied. I learned from the best. He met her eyes. You chose this life. She nodded. Every day. He closed the notebook and reached across the table, taking her hand. So did I. Outside, people hurried past, chasing plans, distractions, escapes. Brian watched them for a moment, then turned back to Maggie. Any regrets? He asked. She thought about it, not defensively, not nostalgically, just honestly. No, she said. I don't miss chaos. I don't miss confusion. I don't miss wondering where I stand. He squeezed her hand. Good. She tilted her head, studying him. You know, you could have lost me. I know. And you didn't try to stop me. No, Brian said. I trusted you to choose. She smiled, eyes soft. You were right. They sat there quietly, coffee cooling between them, the future stretching out. Not loud, not performative, but real. Brian thought of something he'd realized over the past year. Love wasn't proven by how hard you held on. It was proven by how clearly you stood. Maggie leaned across the table and kissed him, unrushed, unafraid. They weren't cameos in each other's lives. They were co-authors. And the story they were writing didn't need an escape hatch. Just intention and time.